car was being treated like the new girl in town. After the initial curiosity, hostility set in. Clergymen pointed out that their use was not sanctioned by either the Old or the New Testaments. And politicians were still after the horse vote. If we cannot barricade our streets against these snorting, hissing demons, then we had better enlarge our hospitals for their victims and our penitentiaries for their drivers. The fire that blackened the city of San Francisco did the same for the reputation of the motor car. Someone started the rumor that they were used exclusively to evacuate the aristocrats of Nob Hill. When it was pointed out that these machines were mostly used for relief and rescue work, few people listened. After all, horseless carriages weren't even an American invention. Their origin was European. And they even had an ugly French name, automobile. Their drivers were called chauffeurs. Besides, they permitted a shameless flaunting of stocking when boarding them, which was downright Parisian. It's small wonder, moralized the family paper, that ladies of the ensemble and other flashy theatrical types prefer this type of vehicle. Its machinery is activated by a material which burns not unlike brimstone. They were also being denounced as rich men's toys, playthings for the few and the very few, devil wagons in which our wealthy and flannel samurai were hurtling down the primrose path of privilege at 20 miles to the hour. The president of Princeton, Woodrow Wilson, said, "Nothing has spread socialistic feeling more than the use of the automobile. They are a picture of arrogance and wealth with all its independence and carelessness." If the voting booth was still a safe refuge for men, the road was not. Women were learning to drive. Mrs. Hamilton Fish was learning to drive. Unaware of his place in history, a man stepped into her path. He was thoroughly intersected 3 times by the same car, making him the most, if not the first pedestrian to be run over. The automobile age had really arrived.
In Detroit, a man named Henry Ford left the farm and came to the city to do his machinery, making what he called a quadricycle. It looked like a buggy, only it had no shaft or harness to it. The horsepower was going to come from a gasoline engine, which he made himself. He did everything himself, working nights and holding down a daytime job with the Detroit Illuminating Company. It took a long while to make this machine, but Henry Ford stuck to it. Finally, it was ready. One momentous night, he pushed it out of the barn for its first trial run. Up and down the dark, empty streets rode Henry Ford on the quadricycle. If anybody woke up and looked out the window, they would think that they were still dreaming. That night, history was made. The streets were never the same again. Men like Henry Ford were putting their faith in the gasoline engine. He built a big one and put it in a racing car called the 999. It was a huge, heavy monster, and it spent most of its time in a shop being tuned up. Nobody at the time realized it, but the 999 had a prophetic look. This was no horseless carriage. It was long and low and powerful, built for speed. In a crude but unmistakable way, it forecast the shape of cars to come. On October 25, 1902, Barney Oldfield set a world record in the 999. He drove it a mile a minute, ushering in a new era. The going was rough for those early cars on the American road. We should pause to remember and admire not only the adventurous men who began making the automobiles, but the reckless few who had the courage enough to drive them. Cars now became more and more a frequent sight, especially in the cities. In 1903, there were more than 1,000 automobile manufacturers in the United States. And in that year, the Ford Motor Company began its works. The first payroll didn't take much bookkeeping. The first car of the new little company was called the Model A. It had a 2-cylinder, 8-horsepower engine that could go 30 miles an hour. It sold for $850, which was a lot of money in those days, and its owners were chiefly in the upper bracket. It was smart and fashionably designed, with a door in the rear like a pony car. And it cranked from the side, a good safety measure designed so that the person that's cranking would not be run over if it accidentally started up. Everybody admired it. Only the most daring would be persuaded to drive in any kind of a motor car. The farmer was a forgotten man during these early periods of the automobile. He saw an occasional car going down the road, these strange contraptions, he figured. They were for city people, not for farmers. He kept grooming his old reliable horse and waited. And suddenly, one day, it appeared. It was called the Model T. It had a 4-cylinder, 20-horsepower engine and a planetary gear. Maybe it didn't look fancy, but it could take a beating on those rough country roads. It was a farmer's car, built by a farmer. There was only one thing wrong with it. It cost $850. Millions of citizens looked at the Model T and licked their chops. There it was, the car of their dreams, but they couldn't afford it. Back in Detroit, Henry Ford wondered how he could bring the cost of the Model T down so that the average citizen could buy one. He figured that the more cars that he would build and sell, the cheaper the car could be made, and he went to work on this idea. In those days, each car was built from the frame up on sawhorses. There was a different crew for each car. The same crew stayed on each car until it was finished. That meant duplication of efforts, a lot of time wasted. So they tried moving the men from car to car. Each man had a special job to do, and as soon as he finished it, he moved on to the next car and did the same thing there. That was better, but it took 12.5 hours to assemble the Model T. Henry Ford watched it for a while, and he had an inspiration. Instead of moving the men, why not move the cars past the men? So on one hot August morning, Henry Ford gave the order to one man who had rope tied around one of the cars. He said, Get it going. Let's get it done. And at that very moment, as the workmen began to fasten the parts onto the chassis, the assembly line was born. A technique that was revolutionized mass production all over the world. Once they found that the idea would work, they began to improve it. They rolled the chassis down a single line of track, pushing it from crew to crew. And the more expert they became at this new method, the faster the cars came off the assembly line, and the Model T's price began to drop. They tried the same idea on all various parts of the car, and they created what was called a sub-assembly. Each man on the line became a specialist. Minute by minute, production was winning the battle over wasted time and wasted effort. Parts were fed to the workmen by gravity slides, so they wouldn't have to stop and wait for new parts. Then they put the parts on moving conveyor belts. This was a great step forward because now they could regulate the workflow. It would be moving at a constant rate of speed. And the conveyor belts became more and more complex as they moved the parts in the shop from place to place. They became fantastic pieces of engineering. And the battle against wasted time and wasted effort was being won. The cars came off the assembly line at a rate of 1 every 40 seconds. And what Henry Ford had foreseen happened. Mass production of the Model T drove the prices down on the Model T from $850 to $300. Now everybody could have one.